Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over my top 10 decks for the EUIC. This is going to be post-rotation with the introduction of Temporal Forces, of course. The EUIC is going to be kicking off this brand new format, and we do have a number of regional events in this metagame as well, so going to be an important one to keep track on. I've got the Japanese City League data, I've got the Play Limitless online event data, and I have the community rating to help aggregate a ranking here. This is not my opinion, this is just based on the placements in both the Japanese format as well as the online data that we have so far, but I also have a lovely matchup spread and deck list for each of these as well, so let's get into it. In at number 10 then we have Ancient Box. This is a new archetype coming out from the set, relying on Roaring Moon's damage output from that vengeful fletching attack, dealing 70 plus 10 more for each ancient card in your discard pile. So you are roughly having around 29 plus ancient cards within your deck list, almost half the deck essentially, so that you can constantly be pushing this single prize damage output a little bit further turn by turn to become a great beat stick as you work towards the later game. Some of the high profile unfavorable matchups include Charizard, also not looking great into the future hands matchup, as well as Arctina. Lugia and Snorlax are also iffy, as is the Great Tusk. So there really are a number of high-profile awkward matchups. Some of the interesting favourables include chien-pao. Very few decks actually have this favourable of a chien-pao matchup, so that's something to bear in mind, where we have some very bulky single-prize Pokemon, which chien-pao basically is inefficient into throughout the entire game, which is kind of nice, and their hit points are low enough that we can be churning out prizes quite happily. And we're also pretty good into the Lost Zone decks as well, which is nice, where again, they just don't have many efficient answers for such bulky single prizes that we can throw at them every single turn. The community rank this one inside the top 10. It has been performing just about in that 10th spot in the online tournaments and has sat just outside of that in the Japanese City League data. Getting onto the deck list, my main sort of innovation is just doubling up to 2 Slitherwing right now, because I do think Iron Hands, being one of your high-profile awkward matchups, can be alleviated somewhat by having the pressure of that Burning Turbulence from that Slitherwing. Even though the opponent can be taking 2 prizes back into you because you are so heavily damaging your own Slitherwing, early on in the game, Roaring Moon can't really get to that 230 threshold too quickly, whereas Slitherwing can be that instant answer card that you can throw at them. So I do think it's going to put in a big shift here. I'm currently not playing a Great Tusk Tech one-of, which you sometimes see within the deck list. You're already quite unfavourable into the control and stalling matchups, and because many of the lists don't play any switch card whatsoever, it's actually kind of an awkward card to have in the deck, because whenever you lead the Great Tusk, it's actually very bad for you. You're essentially playing the Great Tusk so that you can get to a late game stage where you can rod it back in and get it back in a turn, put it into play and swing with it to get sort of cheesy surprise wins, but I don't think that actually comes off all that often, especially because in many late game situations, people are going to use Iono against you. That's like their main way to stop this archetype, and it means you're not going to be able to get that combo off, so I'd rather just have more reliable leads within the deck instead. We're leading into that high counter-catcher count because we do want to be using our ancient supporters throughout the game, specifically that Sada, which is massive for maintaining our attackers. Onto other tech options, I did mention the Great Tusk. I don't think it's fantastic, but it has made its way into a number of deck lists, but I think it's so rare that it actually comes up that it's not really worth a space compared to things like Futtermane, which can be a more relevant, annoying lead for you. Switch card you could have in addition or instead of Dark Patch if you really want to. It can allow you to be a little bit more flexible between turns, which I think is a reasonable card to include. And then finally Cobalion as a sort of damage modifier to help you push into Charizard, and I suppose to an extent to help out in the mirror match and against Roaring Moon EX to reach your breakpoints that little bit quicker. The fact that we play double Super Rod means it is recyclable even if it's going to get targeted, or if we just randomly mill it from our Pokestop, we can still get this back into the action to try and reach towards high damage output towards the latter stages of the game. Or indeed so that we can be threatening 2-hit KOs much earlier on in the game with our Roaring Moon into Charizard EX. If you're expecting a huge wave of Charizard at the EUIC, I would certainly consider this Cobalion inclusion, but bear in mind it has a 2 retreat cost, so you also have to play Switch card in your list at that stage as well. Coming in at number 9 then, we have Gardevoir. It's still somehow just about hanging on as a relevant deck in our format, despite how many cards it loses to rotation. It still has gained and retained just about enough to be a coherent archetype, and actually does boast a couple of really nice favourable matchups. Charizard, Lugia, Arctina, and we get a bonus in having a decent Great Tusk matchup. These are mostly strong matchups because we have such great uptrade potential with our single prize Pokemon. In many cases, Charizard and Arctina only play 1 Lost Vacuum, so even though they can sculpt out a multi-prize turn by vacuuming away a heavily damaged single prizer, they still usually have to combine this with a gusting effect in the same turn, and although you would think it would be easy with both these archetypes having pretty solid engines behind them, because Gardevoir still has that Screamtail to knock out engine Pokemon, it has Countercatcher, and of course it has a heavy line of Iono still, Gardevoir is still a very good deck at starving the opponent from many options throughout the game. Gardevoir's worst matchups include the Lost Zone variants, which are very tricky. That combination of early pressure from Cramorant, having Greninja threat, having Sableye threat means the board gets really cluttered with tech basic Pokemon for Guardy and less engine space. And you don't really have much combat potential either, because even your tanky Gardevoir EX can be KO'd by both Lost Box using Roaring Moon and Tina using their V-Star power. So there's not really much wiggle room outside of just Iono spam against them. Snorlax can still be a tricky one with the limited amount of switching cards in the deck. You also don't enjoy the pressure of Future Hands or chien-pao. The community have rated it within that top 10, and it's also performing okay in online tournaments, a little bit better than in the Japanese city leagues. We've got a pretty straightforward deck list with this one, that Arven engine helping us get that TM evolution, so we will like to go second with the archetype more often than not, so we can get that evolution immediately into Double Curlier to establish our engine and begin to churn through the deck. You'll notice still that heavy count of Iono and 2 Countercatcher, similar to old Gardevoir really, knowing that we are going to take a couple turns setting up, and that ideally we can catch up with our chain of single prizers throughout the mid game that can uptrade. You'll notice there's Churro and Collapse Stadium to remove Gardevoir EX to try and force that prize map into the latter stages. Churro, of course, alongside the Palpad, going to give you some play into the Control and Great Tusk matchups. For other options, Research can be a fantastic dig into the deck, and we've seen this synergize nicely with Gardevoir in the past, especially when we are already playing Palpad already. We have so much recovery in the deck that just seeing more and burning through cards in the opening stages can develop the best board possible. And Mimikyu, that safeguard ability, especially because we have so many hit point buffing tools anyway within the deck, you can actually sculpt a different type of game planning in certain matchups. In at number 8, we have Arceus Giratina. It's basically where the community rate it, as well as basically where it's been performing in both Japan and in the online results. It has a pretty wide matchup spread really, with some very favourables into Snorlax, which is quite a notable one, as well as Great Tusk and Ancient Box. It also comes out more often than not on top against the Charizard players and Future Hands. It's pretty even into the Lost Zone matchups. You have Eerie, you have Judge and Iono. You're constantly trying to throw hurdles at the opponent to stop their tempo. The headaches really come from the chien-pao matchup, where again, Eerie is going to try and be one of your key defenses here, but we know that chien-pao has the stopping power to get through us. And the biggest unfavourables being Gardevoir with their single prize uptrade potential, and Lugia, which equally has uptrade potential with its Chinchino, but also Lugia can so easily stay out of range of your attacking threats, with good old V-Guard energy going onto their Lugia pretty comfortably, and whenever the Lugia player goes first, they are threatening your Vs very early on in the game and will often race you efficiently. Onto the deck list, as you can see, Eerie is such a crucial component of the Lost Zone matchups, which are currently even, so playing an extra copy can really help out, as well as helping chien-pao, which is also quite an awkward one without the help of this disruption. There's also the Radiant Gardevoir within the deck list. It's notably decent for the mirror match, but also can help out against the Lost Zone Giratina and Lugia to certain extents as well. We've got the Churro, we've got the Jet, we've got 2 copies of Switch, we have Nestash Bibarel as an option. This gives us tons of play into the controlling matchups, and in general we're just trying to set up a pretty powerful engine with the Bibarel and just constantly spam hand disruption at the opponent turn by turn. As we've seen from internationals in the past, Arceus continues to be a reliable performer in higher tier events. Having that Starbirth at your disposal at the very least keeps you in games and asks questions of the opponent throughout the entire set. Going into other options, the Lost City is the most popular stadium coming out within Arctina, but I've actually tested most of my games with League Headquarters, helping out against the Lost Box matchup even more so, and also helping out against Future Hands. Choice Belt can certainly offset the math of V-Guard energy to help out against the Lugia matchup, and could also be the tech for the tech in the mirror if Radiant Gardevoir is going to see play. And then Professor's Research could be a single copy option in the deck as well, just so that you can Starbirth for a different supporter if you know your opponent is already passing into you. Currently we only have hand refreshing supporters for both sides of the field, so having a Research in the deck would mean that if your opponent is bricking, you don't have to feed them a fresh hand. In at number 7 we have Snorlax Stall. The community are a bit higher on this one than its placements would suggest right now, and Snorlax's matchup spread is kind of ridiculous, where it either has very, very good or very, very bad matchups. So if you are someone playing Snorlax, you're basically saying, let my matchup roulette take the wheel here, and that matchup roulette will be dictating how your day plays out in the EUIC, because you're either very, very good into a bunch of matchups or very, very poor. The ones you're trying to dodge include Arctina, which is just Judge Iono spamming and have a ton of switch outs, Lost Tina, which will zone away a lot of your stalling targets, whilst again having a ton of switch outs in the deck and a natural shred option. Lost Zone Box also has a ton of switching options and some annoying EX attacking options, and Lugia as well, where almost its entire deck is just attackers, so there's not really anything you can trap, and again they play a ton of switching cards. On the flip side, typically Charizard, chien-pao, Gardevoir, Future Hands, Great Tusk, and even the Ancient Box, they typically don't play enough switching cards generally, or don't don't have enough reliable ways around the likes of Mimikyu, especially if you can cape it up, or even if they do have sufficient outs, they are likely to get hit with an Eerie at some point in the game to swing things back into your favour. Onto the deck list then, again keeping things pretty simple. I'm slowly creeping up my Crushing Hammer count within the deck list because I do think it can be relevant into the likes of Giratina and Lugia. At the very least, making them draw cards and naturally cycle through their own deck and get rid of resources at times, as to not buy you free turns. Beyond that, it's a really straightforward 60. For other options, Lost Vacuum shown up in a number of these deck lists. Ultra Ball is a kind of weird tech card, but you can use this to get rid of useless cards, especially supporters, that are not going to help you in certain matchups, so that when your opponent is using those panic Ionos and whatnot, you're less likely just to draw it back into junk. And adding a Luminous Energy into the deck list would give you a third energy if you ever need to attack with Chi-Yu-EX for damage, but also opens up Mimikyu-EX to also damage your opponent's Pokemon to pressurize them in a different way. In at number 6, we have Lost Zone Giratina. Its fall from grace really hasn't been that far. It seems to have landed on a cloud and is still pretty much okay even without Path of the Peak in format. Its Charizard matchup is buffered nicely with the Iron Lee's introduction. You enjoy seeing any Gardevoir players that are picking it up. You're happy to see the Control and Great Tusk matchups. You have enough bulk into the future hands, and you can still hand disrupt those Lost Zone players to make that matchup actually low-key a little favoured right now. Your only real unfavourables come in the form of Chien-pao and Lugia. These are quite high profile and likely popular decks at the EUIC. Chien-pao having so many ways to take multiple prize turns against you with their Greninja and Iron Hands. And of course, Chien-pao does not struggle to push through your V-Stars. And similar story for Lugia, they have Mist Energy now, so they can undo a lot of your pressure from Star Requiem, and your Sableye becomes much less effective. Not only do they have that Cinccino for uptrade potential into your V-Star, but they also have Snorlax to be very efficient into your single prizes. Looking at the decklist, I have tried to cover a little bit for the more awkward matchups. I have fitted in the Manaphy. I think it's reasonable enough into the Mirror, into Lost Box, and into Chen. And we are playing that copy of Temple of Sinnoh to try and help out against the Lugia matchup. This can be used to unlock so many attacks in the deck, actually. It can unlock Lost Impacts because you're denying V-Guard energy. It can unlock Star Requiem, of course, or it could be used to Sableye, Lost Mine down double Archeops if you've already gone for a Moonlight Shuriken play on them. Meaning that basically any turn of the game that you see Temple of Sinnoh, it's going to be a really powerful play for you. As for other options, many are playing Iona right now. It definitely helps out against Great Tusk and can surprise your opponent with slightly earlier hand disruption than they may expect. Rescue Board is another decent card from Temporal Forces, which you could include into the 60 to give Comphase more pivot potential. And in Japan, at the very least, we have seen a ton of Forest Seal Stone plus Lost Vacuum combinations. There are actually a lot of matchups where you don't absolutely need to use your Star Requiem, so having this extra one-of copy consistency card coming into your deck list is generally quite welcome within Giratina. Coming in at number 5 then, we have Future Hands. It's doing pretty okay in online events and has had decent popularity in Japan, and the community are also rating it within that top 5. This deck boasts one of the best times into Lugia, also farms the Great Tusk and Ancient boxes. It's pretty solid into Lost Box and Gardevoir. You are struggling into some of the bulkier archetypes, with both Giratinas being less favoured, Charizard also being a very difficult time for you, and typically Snorlax will be able to block you out of the game. Onto the deck list, there seems to have been a shift away from a Gift Energy package within this deck list towards having Psychic Energy as well as Mew EX as your main means of Iono and hand disruption protection. Incorporating Psychic allows Miraidon to be a much more dangerous attacker, and also enables the Iron Crown to have a Twin Shuttles option in the deck as well. Interestingly, because this deck does play Countercatcher and Iono, you actually can create some situations where you can shuttle down things in the late game if you are looking to make a comeback. For the most part, people have abandoned ship from the reboot pod and are sticking with Prime Catcher. When you are playing this Arven engine, it just gives you so much flexibility in the opening stages of the game to make the most out of your peak acceleration to take early game prizes, or to cash in on your Ampy very much when required. You'll notice there's also 2 switch carts within the 60s, so with your boss's orders, switch carts, Prime Catcher, and the Psychic Energy within the list, you do actually have some play into Snorlax now. So it seems the general consensus online is that players are trying to respect this matchup rather than scoop to it entirely. For other options, if you're not convinced by the Psychic Energy, and personally I love playing Gift Energy within the list, it still can be a really powerful option to secure your late game, knowing that you are drawing a huge number of cards once Iron Hands is getting KO'd. If you do want to incorporate the Gift Energy, you have to go high count. I think 3 is the sweet spot for this. The most recent results have indicated that Mew is the superior option, but I was a massive fan of Gift when I was playing this deck. And for a couple other future Pokemon you could incorporate in the deck, with great searchability, Iron Bundle can give you even more means of gusting the opponent's Pokemon out the way, trying to craft those easier prize maps, and also possibly capitalize on early generator hits. And a Miraidon EX could come into the deck list to give you some higher damage cap with that Cyber Drive option to help reach into Arceus and Giratina more reliably. In at number 4 then, and surprisingly the community aren't that high on Lost Zone because it was the second best performer in Japan and is still performing very nicely in online tournaments despite being notably less popular than other archetypes right now. The data suggests that even your unfavorables aren't that bad. You're coming in a little unfavored into Ancient Box, Giratina, Great Tusk, and Future Hands. You have close matchups into Arctina. This has got a lot better recently with Hooper EX being a mainstay within the deck list. You're kind of fighting fire with the chien-pao matchup. You both have Greninja, you both have Iron Hands options. You both have one-hit KOs into their multi-prizes. And the Lugia matchup, thanks to your own Iron Hands, is also coming out fairly even. The Charizard matchup has been slowly ticking towards the Lost Box favor recently, which is quite interesting. And you're also having a good time into Snorlax and Gardevoir. I've tried not to spread the Lost Zone box too thin, because I do think that's kind of the trap that some Lost Zone builds are falling into right now. Trying to be an all-singing, all-dancing deck with text for everything can get you into some trouble. I am still playing the Iron Bundle, even though I don't rate Ancient Box that highly, because it can still complement your early game Spit Innocently plays, and generally be a handy option for amp you very much in the mid game. Like I said, Hooper EX is proving itself more and more within the 60, helping out against the Arceus matchup as well as Future Hands, whilst of course not disrupting your energy count all that much. Spiritomb has recently popped up. It obviously can be found with the Buddy Poffin, so it can be established quite early against certain matchups. You can deny Snorlax and Charizard their draw from Rotom. You can also stop a Lugia using Lumineon in the opening stages of games, so it can be a pretty worthwhile Pokemon putting into play in a number of matchups. Crisis Punch can certainly help out against Arceus and Giratina, and possibly to a certain extent Charizard as well. In the current list, I'm playing 2 Artisan, 2 Pokegear, but if you want to flip-flop some counts to try and incorporate Raikou V as an extra lightning attacking option into Lugia, then you can have Town Store Forest Hill Stone within the list to be almost an alternate option to have some extra consistency within the deck, as we have seen this combo in the past. In at number 3, entirely balanced with the online results, the Japanese results, and the community rating, we have chien-pao. You're essentially conceding your control and mill matchup and also have basically no efficient attackers into Ancient Box in order to have an even or better matchup spread against the other archetypes in format. You're pretty even into Charizard, Future Hands, and Lost Box, and enjoy seeing the Arctinas, Gardevoirs, Lugias, and Lostinas of the world. Nothing too alarming about the deck list. We are still trying to have really high item ratios for those Pokestops. I'm currently all the way up to 3 copies of Super Rod to give you some eerie protection, and Cypher Maniac is just a godsend for a combo deck like this. There are a few other water Pokemon we could search out from Irida. Manaphy can give you extra protection, could be relevant for mirror matches against Lostina and Lost Box. Kyogre's one of the better attacking options you could have into some of your worst matchups, because rather than discarding your energy, you're returning them to your hand. So against the likes of Snorlax, Great Tusk, and Ancient Box, you're hitting a very reasonable amount of damage turn by turn without exhausting your resources too quickly. Iron Bundle is just another searchable option to have in the deck to once again carve out easier prize maps. The deck is only right now playing Prime Catcher and Counter Catcher, which has to be timed effectively, so the bundle could unlock the door for possibly Iron Hands or chien-pao prizes later on in the game. In at number 2 then, the community is ranked number 2, doing the 2nd best in online events, 4th best in city leagues, and of course being the Fukuoka Champions League winning deck, we have Lugia V-Star, and it's not hard to see why this deck is doing so well right now. Its matchup spread is really, really promising. You're basically going for an early lunch against the Future Hands deck. You're also not that great into the Uprising of Gardevoir recently. You're slightly unfavored into chien-pao and Lost Box, but just take a look at the number of favorables that you have here. You enjoy seeing the Snorlax and Great Tusk. You're great into both Tina variants, Lost and Arceus. You've got a nice Charizard matchup, and you also pick up a decent Ancient Box. We're pretty tech-free within Lugia because its own worst enemy is itself, of course, so we're sticking pretty tried and true to the Fukuoka 60. The other options I'd really consider mostly just juggling around with counts, to be honest with you, looking at things like an extra Research coming into the deck list, an extra Lumineon, an extra Minccino. Those would mostly be the things that I'd be considering, but if you do want a second Stadium card in the deck to help around Temple of Sinnoh, which is not only showing up in Snorlax but also against the likes of Giratina now, having Mesagoza is reasonable. You could simply go second Collapse as well. It's a very good Stadium card to see at certain moments in games, but Mesagoza can be useful on the opening first 2 turns of the game, which is the most important ones for Lugia specifically. And of course, MewEX having a genome hacking option can be good. One of the only downsides of Chinchino is that you have to constantly be getting your stream of Minccino earlier on in games, and if your aromas aren't working out, if your draw supporters aren't getting you towards these basics, you can find moments in games where you fizzle, but having MewEX gives you that sort of burst attacking option within the deck, which can really help out in that regard. In at the undeniable number 1 right now then, the community, the online results, and the Japanese data all point towards Charizard being our strongest deck in format right now, and its matchup spread is confusing. Why is it doing this well if its only favorables include Future Hands and Ancient Box? Although these are fine decks to play, they're not the most popular out there right now. You've got even matchups into chien-pao and Great Tusk, but a number of fairly unfavorables and some high-profile, very unfavorable matchups in Snorlax and Giratina Lost Zone. I think it comes down to the fact that Charizard Pidgeot has has usually not much less than like a 45% into even your unfavorable matchups. And typically you're going to be the one dictating the Ionos, the counter catchers, and the other sort of swing cards in games to force your opponent into awkward situations. So even though Charizard EX's matchup spread isn't that favorable, you have to bear in mind that it is sort of flying that flag as Bediff right now, so the format is evolving around it. It's not surprising to see a deck as dominant as this have a harsh matchup spread. I've continued to keep this deck list as simple as possible because I do believe the inherent strength of the archetype is that good, and I really like maxing out my ball search counts so I can go first in a number of matchups as well. As for other options, I have heard a number of murmurings around the Nightgate Gengar, which you can use as a tech card against Snorlax. A much softer tech would be a Charmeleon that has a heat tackle option that can get through Mimikyu in one attack, and possibly if you are going down this avenue, you could incorporate Lost City in your deck as well to get rid of the Mimikyu for good. And Eerie is a really well-rounded supporter card that fits quite nicely into Charizard because you have the search ability from Pidgeot. This card can help out against chien-pao, Lost Zone, the Mirror, even against the stalling matchup. So Eerie is such a powerful supporter card, I could definitely foresee making a space for it. And if you're going down that line of thinking, you could also then incorporate a TM Devolution, a card that we've already seen be quite strong for the mirror match, but combined with Eerie, you can find many more spots for this to be powerful, specifically against chien-pao as well, where you can cheese their candies. Quick shout out to a handful of other archetypes that are worth discussing that sit outside the top 10 decks right now. Roaring Moon EX, with the baby Roaring Moon included, is still one of the better tempo archetypes of the format. It does lose quite a lot with VIP Pass rotating and Galarian Moltres being a Forest of Stone target, but this archetype is still definitely on my testing table and was a top 10 performer in Japan as well. Goldengo seems to be in the shadow of chien-pao overall, but its matchup spread is slightly different and is still a relatively powerful archetype. Future Box is an interesting one where it still feels like we're in that building testing process. Overall, I think it usually gets a little bit too spread thin, but if we narrow in this deck to just have a few key matchups that you're targeting, I do foresee some players going quite deep with this archetype. Espathra Burnett's had some highlight reel moments in online tournaments and does have a number of answers to different archetypes, with the combination of grass type coverage, this annoying ability, and the potential to have item lock in certain matchups. Dialga V-Star may not be consistent, but it is really, really cool, and you can still take 2 turns, so I do think there could be some popularity around this archetype as well. The final one I wanted to touch on, and certainly could be considered within these top 10 decks alongside Snorlax itself, is the Pidgeot Snorlax. This is probably of this page the most powerful archetype among them, where you're essentially trading some percentage into future hands and Giratina to buff your mirror match quite substantially and also have a better time into Lost Box. We don't quite have enough online data for this archetype to have a full picture of the Pidgeot build of Snorlax, but I do think it could still go far in the tournament. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great time at the EUIC. I'll see you there, or I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.